Nā mai haere mai. To celebrate the University of Canterbury's 150th anniversary, the Department of History is welcoming back and honouring a diversity of our graduates from across the decades. Ko Katie Pickles tōku ingoa, and I'm going to ask our guests tonight, and in particular we have Dr. Vincent O'Malley, about their memories of their time as a student, discuss their life since graduating, and how history has proved useful, and seek advice for those who are studying history today and into the future. So tonight we're in the 1980s, the mid-80s and through to the early 90s. We're going back 30 years plus with Dr. Vincent O'Malley. Vincent is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He's a member of the Royal Society of New Zealand. He's an award-winning and best-selling historian. He's written and published extensively on the history of Māori and Pākehā relations in 19th century New Zealand in particular. Vincent's also a founding partner of HistoryWorks, a Wellington research-based consultancy specialising in Treaty of Waitangi research. Now, Vincent has written a staggering 10 books so far, and the most recent being Voices from the New Zealand Wars, and that was published by Bridget Williams Books in 2021. And with Joanna Kidman, Leanna MacDonald, Tom Roa, and Kezia Wallace, Fragments from a Contested Past, which was also Bridget Williams Books 2022. Now, the latter was drawn from research from a Marsden funded project into how 19th century New Zealand wars have helped shape memory, identity, and history. Now, in 2022, Voices from the New Zealand Wars won the general non-fiction category at the Ockham New Zealand Book Awards. And in the same year, last year, Vincent was named the winner of the Prime Minister's Award for Literary Achievement in Non-Fiction. He was a semi-finalist as well in the Kiwibank New Zealander of the Year for this year, 2023. He has also received multiple research grants and awards. And in 2014, he was a J.D. Stout Research Fellow at Te Haranga Waka. Now, when he was there on his book about the history of the Waikato War, which is the Great War for New Zealand, and of course, that's one of his sort of groundbreaking points and that he makes as a historian, taking those words from Wiremu Tamahana, one of the founder of the Kingitanga movement, who described the Waikato War as the Great War for New Zealand. And of course, most people think immediately of the First World War. So that's just one important intervention of many that Vincent has made to date. So we're in the 1980s, and welcome back, Vincent, to Canterbury History Department. It's great to be able to honour you tonight. And
Katie, it's great to be here. Yeah.
Welcome. So you were here in the mid-80s. So was I. So have some memories of it as well. And so what do you remember?
Well, the first thing is, I mean, my standing joke is that I started in the history department at Canterbury University at the age of 15, which is true, but I wasn't there as a student. I started as a cleaner. So to give a bit of background, I grew up as part of the Irish Catholic community in Christchurch. My father worked at Addington Railway Workshops. My mother was a cleaner, and actually she was my boss. So as soon as I could legally get an adult job, I started cleaning 5 nights a week, 6 to 9, and I was in the history department. And so that was an interesting experience for me, because I think you can tell a lot about people about how they treat their cleaners. And I remember Anne Parsonson was somebody who was always there every night at 6 p.m. She was still working, and she was, she was lovely, and she was very kind in that. And at school, I mean, I loved history. That was my great passion, but my history teacher refused to teach us any New Zealand history. He said, I remember I asked him one day, I said, sir, why aren't we learning any New Zealand history? And he said, forget it, lad, it's boring, nothing happened here. And so we just did European history. And, as I say, history was my passion. I loved that. So when I went to university 3 or 4 years later, this time as a student, I enrolled in a whole bunch of European history courses. And I dug out an old CV to see what what my first year was, and medieval history, Renaissance and Reformation. I did Roman history and classics as well. And it was only later on I decided to drop out of something else. I think it was economics. And I was looking for a filler course, and I looked in the Cantor magazine and said New Zealand history to 1890. And I thought, well, that will be boring. I mean, my history teacher at school told me that. But, it's a filler course, I'll do that. And I did that with Anne Parsonson, and it blew me away. And I thought, why didn't I learn this history at school? So once I had that initial exposure, that was me. And so after that, my real focus with my history degree was on New Zealand history, and I loved that. And
Yes.
as I say, just having that initial exposure was incredible.
Yes, no, absolutely. But isn't it amazing how it's not that long ago and there was still that what we might call prejudice towards Eurocentric history that you still can hear around today.
Yeah, well, to be fair, I think my history teacher was probably a victim of the education system himself, and that he hadn't had that exposure to it. And there's a lovely footnote to this, which is 4 or 5 years ago, I was giving a talk, I think it was the New Zealand History Teachers Association conference in Hamilton, and I talked about that. And somebody came up to me at the end and said, "Hi, remember me?" And I thought, "Oh, not sure." He said, "I'm your old history teacher." And I thought, well, that's awkward. That's very awkward, isn't it? Because I said he was a great history teacher, but he refused to teach us New Zealand history. But he told me that years later, he went off to a school in the North Island where most of the students were Māori. And he had this light bulb moment. He thought, why am I teaching Tudor and Stuart history to a room full of Māori? And so he went off and learnt New Zealand history himself, probably for the first time. And like me, once he had that initial exposure, he was away. And so he was the last person I thought would be at a conference of New Zealand history teachers, but he had become an advocate for himself. So that was beautiful to see that change.
Yeah, and I think that most of us who love and appreciate history, we often like all types of history, don't we? It's a very broad church, sort of pun intended, and so yeah, it just happens to be what you are exposed to quite often, and those and then you go, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way before. So yeah, absolutely. But yeah, the way it sort of was, because we had some pretty amazing things going on here in the late 80s that I think you just come along here and sort of soak things in, don't you? But you mentioned Anne Parsonson, and of course it was a time of awakening and renaissance for Ngāi Tahu at the time, of course, with the claim, and that history was being made, wasn't it, at that moment? When we look back now, we see that it was such an important moment for the making of history. And I think you were a beneficiary of some of the courses there. Yeah, the hands-on, the hearing, literally from hearing from hearings, and that integrated into teaching.
Absolutely. So like in honours year, I had Tepne Regan. I think his course was called Rangatira and Sovereignty, the Interface. And this was in 1991. I did my BA 1986 to 1988, and then did an OE, came back, and that was one of the courses I did. And that was incredible. It was like having a front row seat on what was happening with the Ngāi Tahu claim, which was very active at that time. I think the hearings just concluded and the tribunal report came out that year. So Ngāi Tahu were preparing for negotiations, and it was wonderful to have somebody with such immense knowledge to learn from him. And I mean, still at this time, I didn't really imagine that I would have a career as a historian. I didn't really think, that was possible. So there was Tepne Regan, Anne Parsonson. There were others, in 1991 in my honours year, a year ahead of me, I think, Jim McAloon and Tamari Tau, I think, were both doing their master's theses at the time. And they were both also actively involved in the Ngāi Tahu claim. And the other thing that happened as well, which I remember, I think it was 1991, the New Zealand History Association conference was held at Canterbury University, and I was sort of a student volunteer for that, filling up people's glasses of water and that kind of thing. And there was a really strong Ngāi Tahu component in that. So you had Ngāi Tahu and Crown historians who appeared in that to talk about the claim, to talk about the history. And I think that was my first exposure to public history and to treaty history. And that was incredible as well to be part of that. So, you know, in retrospect, it was almost kind of a perfect sort of preparation for what I'd go on to do. I didn't really know at the time that was what it was going to be, but it was, yeah, it was, thinking back, it was I learned so much from Tipani and Anne and the others.
Yes, yeah, it was quite the moment that way. And like you say, it was bringing on the next generation and the names you've mentioned. And of course, we have now the Ngāi Tahu Centre here, which has been for a long time. So it's sort of a whole brought in a whole wave of research and opportunities, and that we still see the benefits of and is still continuing to grow. Is it? So yeah, and thinking of how that came about through those who were before and who were around in the department, like David McIntyre in particular, and you Jim Gardner's and all of the Luke Trainers we've said, and Len Richardson and the whole teams who were teaching. There was this whole sort of ferment there, Graham Dunstall, there's lots. There was sort of a very active group of historians, and that's just to mention one part of the department. So you did your degree 86 to 88, you went on your OE, you came back, you did the honours, and that was where you got to specialise in particular courses, and take these courses, and we take what's on offer. And you were around here. I was thinking too about how, like, when you were talking about your cleaning and sort of the campus we have, and do you remember that people used to be quite anarchistic with marker pens, and in the bathrooms and the toilets, they were sort of the place where there were all sorts of slogans and notices and jokes, or was that just the women's toilets?
I think there was some interesting literature in the men's toilets as well. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because it would just seem, because the campus in the 80s was quite a new campus. It was a very stark, brutalist architecture. It was a campus that had moved from the centre and that very neo-Gothic architecture and the tradition. But it seems somehow, you would have expected the new campus, how it resembles the new universities that had come in the post-war years that had the more radical ideas and that whole sort of ferment, but somehow I think, and this is maybe what's a little bit unique about this place, it managed to bring with it, brought with it its staff and its sort of traditions. So on one hand, where it seemed to be quite go ahead and these new facilities and resources, and it still had this quite sort of stuffy atmosphere of tea rooms and very proper, didn't it? It was a fascinating combo that was happening here at that time.
I remember the history department library used to be stocked with, I think it was the Littleton Times newspaper, hard copies. So having like those primary sources in there, this is decades before papers passed or anything like that. That as a young historian, that was quite exciting that you had them right there.
It was amazing that we had the press, NZPDs as well, parliamentary debates, all sorts of sources, weren't they there? And the sort of the smell of the past was absolutely there. You could smell these resources in newspapers. Yeah, it was sort of, it had this sort of depth and tradition and sort of learning sense, even if these sort of buildings were quite orange and new and so forth. So you, like you said, you didn't, well, do we ever really know what's going to happen in life? But you finished your honours, and I know you got through just about without fees. It was a rapidly changing environment too, wasn't it, for how education was treated, and there was so much happening in New Zealand society at the time as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was fortunate. I was probably, at the tail end of that generation who could just go to university and study what they had a passion for. So I didn't, I didn't really have a vocational plan from that. I just knew that I wanted to study history. After the BA, I went off overseas, and I remember my mother saying, if you want to do further study, you better come back soon, because the fees are doubling next year, and the year after that, they're tripling or whatever. This is the early 1990s. So I came back and did honours here in 1991 as, in response to that.
Yes. Yeah. It was the golden times that way. And yeah, brought in all sorts of change ever since, hasn't it? And expectations and so forth. So you came back and you did that, and then you finished like we said, it was a really fascinating time here to do honours. And then what happened?
So yeah, 1991, finished honours year. Then I spent about a year on a dole. New Zealand was deep in recession in the early 1990s, and late 1992, I think it was Anne Parsonson who got in touch with Professor Alan Ward from the University of Newcastle. And besides being an academic, Alan was also running a treaty, was the chief historian for a treaty agency in Wellington called the Crown Congress Joint Working Party. And that was researching surplus railway lands, and recommended me to him. So I was invited to come to Wellington for a 3-month contract as a historian, as a researcher. And I never left. That was January 1993. That was me, really. Yeah, that was, as I say, I never imagined that I would become a full-time professional historian, but it's been a real privilege to do that, and to work for iwi and hapu around the country, and to learn so much around their history as well, and to meet so many incredible people over the years.
Yes. So doing professional work and also applied work, and just completely relevant history that you can see why it's being done as you do it, isn't it? That's really what you have been doing.
I think that the research that's been done in the treaty claims process over the last 30 years has been incredibly important, and so important for our society in terms of that whole process of learning about our history, engaging with it, and also that secondary process of reconciliation and healing, which in some ways I think we're only starting to catch up with now, in terms of, for a long time, that process was sort of Māori talking to the Crown, and other New Zealanders weren't really part of that conversation, and many people didn't have too much idea about what was happening. And a lot of the coverage of that was pretty sensationalist and misleading. I remember, I think when I was a student, a headline in the press, Ngāi Tahu claims South Island, that wasn't literally true, and it was very misleading and alarmist, and good on stuff for apologising a few years ago for their coverage of Māori issues, but that was kind of the context and the atmosphere that you were dealing with. And so, yeah, I think, that was one of the reasons why I thought it's, so much of this research that's done through the treaty claims process, which is incredibly detailed forensic level research about the experiences of different Māori communities around the country. And it's, as I say, it's usually just, treaty lawyers, claimants, members of the Waitangi Tribunal and so on who get to learn that history. So for me, it was like, how do we share that with the wider community? Because they need to know these stories as well, and they need to engage with that history. I think one of the things that drives me is that this real sense that people need to have an understanding, a basic awareness of the history of the whenua they live on, they go to school on, the street they live on, who's it named after, those kind of things. Just being aware of your context from a historical perspective. So, that was one of the things that sort of compelled me to spend what spare time I had trying to turn some of that into publications through books and blog posts and whatever it takes, really, to ensure that people have at least the opportunity to engage with that history, because I think it's really important for all of us to have a basic awareness of the history of the country that we grow up in.
Yes, and Vincent, you're making it sound easy, and although you've been really dedicated to this, and especially over the last decade, you've been so prolific, because what you're describing is that you're actively always doing all of this research. And for those who might be sort of new to this, in Archives New Zealand and the Turnbull online, so all of and this sort of historical research takes skill, it takes time, yeah, lots of thought. So there's all of that, and then and then hearings and so forth. So as well as doing all of that, you've been dedicated to then think, and this is where I think you're quite unique. There aren't many like you who've actually then thought, well, I want to get this out like you just described to us. And so and often it's history written for for a different audience, isn't it? And so what the skill, so this is where you're making it sound easy, is that you have managed to, and this is what your award in particular is for, you've managed to write the history as accessible for many New Zealanders and internationally as well. And that's not easy to do, is it? Because you have to really think about what it is that the angles you're going to take. What is it about this information that's significant for the public, for a general audience? And that's where well, I mentioned before about the way turning things inside out, talking about the Great War for New Zealand that you did there. Also thinking of your work where you often, yeah, from your research that you're doing that's so pragmatically based, and going, you've actually then gone and thought you've made it very complex about intercultural relations, contact zones and encounters. So that's been a theme in your work as well, that you're constantly interrogating power as well, and the whole imperial project and colonization. So these are all themes, aren't they, that come out in your work? And always, as well as those themes, you've got this intention and so the word passion, the enthusiasm for making it accessible so that people can, that it's about education, isn't it, is what you're doing there. You're sharing knowledge with the general audience, and you've been doing this in all sorts of ways, haven't you? You've been giving talks and writing and...
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the important thing is that people need to understand why it matters. Like, it's not enough just to set out the history. They need to understand the relevance of it for them today.
Yes.
And so that's why, for example, when I'm writing about the New Zealand Wars, I talk about that, we live with the consequences today in so many different ways. Yes. Socioeconomic statistics of Māori communities today, there's a connection there between what happened in the 19th century. And if you look at the 1840s and 1850s, where Māori communities around the country, including Ngāi Tahu, did quite well for quite a while. And there's a dramatic shift in the power dynamic from the 1860s onwards as a result of the New Zealand Wars in the South Island, as a result of those massive Crown purchases, the Kemp Purchase, a third of the country. Henry Tacey Kemp managed to do that without even setting foot on any of the land, which I find quite incredible.
Yes, sweeping.
And so those things, they resonate over generations. So from Māori in the 1840s and 1850s really being the leading drivers of the New Zealand economy, condemned to poverty, and that's something that resonates over generations. It doesn't go away overnight. And as I say, that's why we live with the consequences of that today. And I think one of the points that I try and emphasize in talking about this history is that that people aren't responsible, or people shouldn't feel guilty or ashamed for the actions of their ancestors, but they should recognise and acknowledge that being upfront and honest about our history is the only way that we can learn from that history and begin to heal as a nation by being upfront and honest about it. And I think a lot of, maybe just in the last 5 or 10 years, I think a lot of people accept that and they understand that. And as I said before, so many of us are on learning journeys when it comes to New Zealand history, because huge numbers of us didn't have any exposure to it at school.
Yes.
I did a sort of online survey, well, not a survey, not very scientific, but a Twitter poll I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And from memory, my question was simply, did you learn any New Zealand history at school? So not good, bad, indifferent, whatever, just any. And about 2/3 of people said that they didn't learn anything. And so, you know, that's kind of what we're dealing with now. And that's why I think it's really incredible and important that young people from this year onwards will have at least that basic exposure to the history of the country that they live in. And I think that will be incredibly empowering for them because they have a sense of place. They have a sense of the stories embedded in the land that they live on. And that's, you know, and that's powerful knowledge, I think.
It is. It's powerful knowledge, and it's vital, and it's complex, and there's lots of it, isn't it? Like we started by saying about the sort of throwaway comments of, oh, there's no history here, there's nothing. It's just not true. There's all sorts of really vital, important, and contested, complex history to grapple with that's absolutely relevant to who we are today. So yes, yeah, and it needs to be resourced properly, isn't it, so that those who are developing the new curriculum can really feel valued as not like a sort of a gift. So what sort of advice would you have for our students who are thinking about history or studying history today?
Well, I remember getting asked this question by a school student in Auckland a few years ago. I've done a number of school visits to schools over the years, and he said to me, now, we're both historians. What advice would you give to us younger ones? And I thought it was a good question. My advice to him was firstly, read lots of history by others and find historians whose work you like and kind of work out what it is that you admire about what they do. And the purpose of that is not so that you can ape them, but so that you can work out your own distinctive voice and style. And what I think also the important thing about this is what interests you, because for me that's always been really important, to pursue things that genuinely I think are interesting and important. And everybody has their own perspectives and understandings on that based on their own backgrounds and histories and so on. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing I said to him, which was a much more practical thing, is always write down the reference, because there's nothing worse than you saw something somewhere once, but you can't remember where it was or what it was. So record meticulously your references.
Oh yes, always learning that one. So true. And what you say about history, there's room for everybody, isn't there? And everyone's got their own in particular interests. And yeah, it's such a great pursuit that way, but difficult at the same time. And in your recent work, you've been going to sites of history. You've been on the ground, I think, out of the archives and off the computer screens and into the landscape, and readings that way. How have you found that as an experience?
Oh, I think incredibly valuable. One thing that I understand now, which I maybe didn't at the outset, is just how important it is to visit the sites that you write about. And because you learn from those places, things that you won't find in textual sources, primary sources, or books or whatever. It's really about the context of those places and those sites. And so our Marsden project on remembering and forgetting difficult histories in Aotearoa New Zealand around the New Zealand Wars, as part of that, we've visited a number of these sites, and part of that is looking at what's there, but it's also about what's not there. And this one of the things at the start of this, I thought, gee, how are we going to document silences? That's methodologically, that's a really challenging thing. Like, if there's a void, if there's an absence, what can you say about that other than went there, didn't find anything? But one of the things that occurred to me is that you document what you find instead. And you know, an obvious example of this would be, you know, like, for example, if you go to the Nixon Monument in Otahuhu in South Auckland to Marmaduke Nixon, who was gravely wounded in the attack on Rangiawhia in February 1864, you'll find an acknowledgement there to all of the British and colonial troops who died there, but no reference at all to the Māori who were killed there. I mean, and the other interesting and obvious juxtaposition is the number of monuments and memorials to New Zealand troops who served in World War I and World War II, and the relative absence of similar monuments and memorials to the New Zealand wars.
Yes.
And my argument around this has always been that it's not a competition between the two. Surely we're big enough as a nation to remember, of course, those who served New Zealand overseas, many of them Māori, but also we should be big enough as a nation to remember those who fought and died here as well, because they're also part of our story, and we need to acknowledge and remember them as well if we're going to be upfront and honest around our history. I mean, rather than cherry picking out the bits of the story that we'd prefer to remember. And, you know, for a long time there, prime ministers loved nothing better than to go to Gallipoli or to be seen there, but they wouldn't be seen anywhere near New Zealand Wars commemorations. So it was just a stark contrast in terms of how that was understood. So that was sort of one of the ways that I began to think around those silences in terms of what we choose to remember and forget.
Yes, so stark, the whole forgetting amongst the Pākehā world, and that's where that whole recovering for a general audience of these histories that people just haven't been taught and don't know about is just so important, isn't it? And in the way of doing that with the footnotes and with thoroughness rather than disinformation, because of course we live in such an age of disinformation and fake information, and I think that's something as historians we're constantly dealing with, aren't we, and discerning in what we are doing.
Absolutely. And I mean, increasingly these days I find myself having to push back against stuff that is masquerading as history but which is not at all. And it's always when you're dealing with that, sometimes you're thinking about, like, is responding to that giving it more exposure, because I don't want to do that, but also if I'm silent around this, what are the consequences of that?
Yes.
So, like when I saw last year a book on Rangiawhia that was just contained completely inaccurate descriptions of what took place here. I know a lot of the Tainui, the Ngāti Apakura people who are descendants of those who were killed there, and it's not something you can let pass lightly. So sometimes you do have to stand up and respond to that, and it's not easy, but
no,
I think it is something that needs to happen.
Yes, no, you have to call it. You have to call it out. But like you say, it's not easy, and the difficult histories that are attempting to seek justice, isn't it? A lot of historians were very concerned with justice and social change, and all of this. Sometimes at the moment, I think it can get a little bit sort of in certain advertising and so forth, a little bit trendy and discourses of change making and so forth, but the guts of it is it's really difficult and it's harrowing, and it takes great bravery and to come out and do this. And so Vincent, it's been an absolute pleasure for us to honour you and bring you home for all of the absolutely fantastic, amazing history that you do, and we know you're very appreciated for what you do. And just to go back and think of your beginnings here in the department at the university all those years ago, and just to celebrate really and reinforce everything that you do in the history world and acknowledge it. And I think we'll be looking forward to where you go next and what you do next. I personally think you've been doing a lot of difficult, and maybe it's time to do something we'll see, a little bit less difficult maybe, do you think, or you're going to carry on?
Well, Well, I'm increasingly interested in some aspects of my own story and like the Irish and Māori connection.
Yes.
And that's something I'd love to explore one day if somebody would give me some funding for that.
Yes,
But
there we are.
so you know,
Yes, yeah.
I've got lots of ideas. The challenge is always how do you getting funded for these things.
It
So
is. We need, yeah, more funding for the arts, isn't it? It's vital. The humanities. It's vital to a healthy society, flourishing
well,
society.
yeah, and I mean I know history departments around the country are under siege at the moment, but the University of Canterbury played a critical role in my development, not just as a historian, but as a person as well, because I think even if I'd gone off to do something else, those skills I learned through studying history, critical thinking, for example, would be incredibly valuable, even with things like, you talked about misinformation and disinformation, just incredibly valuable in terms of trying to work out, complex sort of sources and understanding bias and context and where things come from and making sense of those things in a difficult world. So I think history is incredibly valuable for that. And so, I'm grateful for what I learned through the Canterbury History Department.
Well, we're grateful for you taking time out to come back and be honoured. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you soon and your latest work and so forth. Go well. Ka kite anō.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.